You are 61 years old. You just checked your retirement account balance for the third time this week. $84,000. That's it. That is everything standing between you and the next 30 years of your life. And no matter how many times you refresh the page, the number refuses to change into something more forgiving. Your hands are shaking a little, not from age, from fear. A very specific, very cold kind of fear that shows up in the middle of the night when you're supposed to be sleeping, because you just found out your old friend Marcus retired last spring with $1.2 million. Same job title, same salary bracket, same number of years worked, almost to the month. And the difference between his number and your number, a gap of over $1 million, comes down to one decision he made when he was 34 years old. A decision that took him 10 minutes on an ordinary Tuesday night. You made the opposite decision. And the truly terrifying part is, you didn't even know you were making one at the time. It didn't feel like a decision. It felt like doing nothing, which felt safe, which felt responsible. This is the secret that made millions rich. It has nothing to do with luck. Nothing to do with a stock tip whispered at a country club. Nothing to do with being born into money, knowing the right people, or catching some once-in-a-lifetime break that only wealthy families seem to stumble into. It has nothing to do with cryptocurrency, real estate flipping, or some app promising to make you rich while you sleep. By the end of this video, you will see exactly where the fork in the road quietly appeared in your life decades ago, without you even noticing it was there, and exactly what it cost you to walk past it without ever once looking down. Stay with this one to the end, because the ending isn't just Marcus's story. It's the exact moment where your own story either changes tonight or quietly stays the same for another year. Level 1. Age 34. The invisible fork, picture 2. Kitchen tables. Same year. Same kind of town. Same middle-class life. Built one paycheck at a time, one grocery run at a time, one late mortgage payment reminder at a time. At one table sits you, 34 years old, opening a pay stub after a long shift, tired in the particular way that only a full-time job and young kids can make a person tired. 6% of your paycheck goes into your 401k automatically. Your company matches 3% of that. You've never questioned any of it. Not once. You started this job 5 years earlier. HR handed you a stack of enrollment forms during your first overwhelming week. You signed where they told you to sign, and you went straight back to learning your new role and figuring out where the break room coffee machine was. Every single year since, an email arrives labeled Open Enrollment. You skim it for about 10 seconds. You close it. You go back to your day, because you have a mortgage to think about, kids to raise, and a job that already takes everything you have left to give by 5 o'clock. At the other table sits Marcus. Same age, same kind of paycheck, give or take a few $1,000s a year. Same 6% contribution, same 3% match. On paper, at this exact moment in time, you and Marcus are financially identical twins. If someone froze the clock right here and lined your two account statements up side by side, an accountant couldn't tell the two of you apart. Nobody could. But something is different, and it isn't visible yet. It won't be visible for years. Maybe a decade. Marcus, on an ordinary Tuesday night, after the kids are finally asleep, does something almost nobody does. Instead of deleting the retirement account email like he usually does without a second thought, he actually clicks it. He logs in. He scrolls down past the summary page, past the balance, down to the section that shows exactly where his money is actually invested. And what he finds surprises him. His contributions have been sitting in something called a stable value fund since the day he was automatically enrolled 5 years earlier. Not because he chose it. Nobody chooses it. It's the default. It's where your money goes the moment you never tell it to go anywhere else. It's built to feel safe. It barely moves. It also barely grows. You have that exact same default sitting quietly in your account right now, at this exact same moment in the story. You just haven't looked. You've never scrolled past the summary page. Why would you? Nobody ever told you there was anything worth scrolling down to find. This is the fork in the road. And here's what makes it so brutal. It isn't income. It isn't which college either of you went to or didn't go to. It isn't which company hired you, or how hard you worked that particular year, or how many hours of overtime you put in. It's attention. One person looked for 10 minutes, one time. One person didn't. And right now, at age 34, that gap between you is worth exactly $0. It cannot be seen yet. It cannot be measured yet. It doesn't show up on any statement. That is precisely what makes it so dangerous. Invisible gaps are the ones nobody ever fights to close, because nobody can see there's anything to fight for. Level 2. Age 35. The 10-minute decision. 1 year later, Marcus does something that costs him nothing but 10 minutes and a small amount of nerve. He moves his money. He takes his contributions out of that stable value fund and reallocates them into a diversified index fund, the kind that simply tracks the broader stock market instead of parking cash. Somewhere it barely grows at all. He doesn't hire an expensive financial advisor. He doesn't take some paid course promising secret formulas passed down from Wall Street insiders. He clicks a handful of buttons on a website he already had access to the entire time, inside an account he already owned, using money that was already legally his from the moment it left his paycheck. 10 minutes. That is the entire secret people spend their whole lives chasing. In books, in seminars, in expensive courses sold by people with private jets in the thumbnail. You, at 35, do not make this call. And here is the honest, uncomfortable truth about why. Nobody ever told you it mattered. The default felt safe, and safe felt like the responsible choice for a person with a family, depending on them every single month. You weren't reckless. You weren't foolish. You were doing exactly what you believed a careful, sensible adult does, which is leave well enough alone and trust the system to quietly take care of the details on your behalf. Except leaving well enough alone turned out to be the single most expensive decision of your entire financial life, and you didn't even know you were making a decision at all. That's the cruelest part of this entire story. Nobody decides to fail. They simply fail to decide. Here's the part almost nobody explains to people just starting out in their careers. In year 1, the difference between a stable fund earning around 2% and an index fund earning closer to 8% doesn't feel dramatic in the slightest. On a contribution of a few $1,000s, that gap might amount to a few $100s. It genuinely feels like a rounding error, like something not remotely worth losing a night's sleep over, not when there are diapers to buy and a car payment due next week. That is exactly why almost nobody goes back and fixes it. The cost of doing nothing hides itself extremely well in the short term. It waits patiently in the background of your life for years, sometimes decades, quietly compounding in the opposite direction, and it only reveals its true size long after it's far too late to travel back and undo the original choice. There's a third person woven into this story, and his name is Jake. Jake's path is the one most people quietly assume is the smart one, the disciplined one, the one that actually deserves to win. Jake doesn't ignore his account the way you did. Jake checks it constantly, almost obsessively, sometimes multiple times a day during volatile weeks. He watches financial news every single night before bed. He moves his money in and out based on headlines, chasing whatever sector happens to be hot that particular quarter. Panic selling the moment the market dips more than a few percentage points, and jumping back in only once it finally feels safe again, usually well after the recovery has already started without him. Jake believes he's being active. He believes he's being smart, sharp, several steps ahead of everyone else. Jake is about to learn a very expensive lesson over the next 3 decades. Motion is not the same thing as progress. Effort is not the same thing as results. Level 3. Age 45. The gap becomes visible. 10 years pass. Nothing dramatic happens in any of these 3 lives. No lottery tickets. No surprise inheritances. No catastrophic crash that wipes anyone out completely. Just 10 years of ordinary paychecks, ordinary grocery bills, ordinary Tuesdays that blur together the way years tend to do once you're deep in the middle of raising a family and keeping a household running. But the numbers have quietly started to separate, and for the first time, the separation is no longer invisible. Marcus's account, compounding at roughly 8% a year, with steady, entirely unremarkable contributions, has crossed $310,000. Your account, still sitting mostly in that same low-yield stable fund from a decade earlier, has crossed $140,000. Same contributions over those 10 years. Same starting point at age 34. And already the gap isn't just double. It's more than double, because compounding doesn't move in a straight line the way most people picture growth in their heads. It moves the way a snowball moves, rolling down a long hill. Slow near the top, faster through the middle, faster still by the time it reaches the bottom, gathering size on top of size on top of size. And then there's Jake. Jake, who checked his account every single day, who reacted to every headline, who genuinely believed he was outsmarting the market through sheer effort and constant, exhausting attention. Jake's account sits at $95,000. Lower than yours. Lower than the account belonging to the person who did nothing at all for 10 straight years and never once logged in. Why? Because every time Jake panic sold during a downturn, he locked in the loss permanently, turning a temporary paper dip into a real, unrecoverable one. And every time he jumped back in after a recovery had already quietly begun without him, he missed the specific best days that do the overwhelming majority of the heavy lifting in long-term compounding. The data on this is almost eerily consistent, year after year, decade after decade, across nearly every market cycle ever studied. Miss just the 10 single best trading days across a 20-year period, and your total return can be cut in half, or worse. Jake didn't miss those days by accident. He missed them precisely by trying too hard, too often, too emotionally, at exactly the wrong moments. Marcus doesn't feel rich at 45. He's still driving an ordinary, slightly aging car, still living in a house that looks a lot like yours, maybe even a little smaller. From the outside, absolutely nothing about his daily life looks different from yours or from Jake's. That's the part almost everyone misses about this entire story. The secret doesn't show up in how someone lives while it's quietly working away in the background. It shows up decades later, all at once, like a bill finally coming due, except in reverse. Instead of owing something painful, you're suddenly owed something enormous, and you barely had to think about it along the way. Level 4, age 55. The snowball becomes unstoppable. 10 more years pass, the way they always do, faster than anyone ever expects them to. Marcus's account crosses $740,000. Yours crosses $210,000. Jake, to his credit, finally stops trying to time the market around age 50, worn down by 3 decades of stress and mediocre results. He leaves his money alone for the very first time in his entire adult life. His account, still slowly recovering from years of buying high and selling low, sits at around $180,000. Better than nothing at all. Nowhere close to where it could have been if he'd simply left it untouched from the very start. The same way Marcus did. The 10-minute decision Marcus made back at 35 is now worth roughly $500,000, More than your decades of careful, cautious, supposedly safe saving. This is the part that stings the most. And if you feel a knot tightening in your stomach right now, that reaction is completely normal, and you are far from alone in feeling it. You didn't do anything wrong. You showed up to work for 30 straight years. You paid your bills on time, most months. You contributed to your 401k every single paycheck, exactly the way you were told to on your first day of orientation. You didn't gamble your family's future away at a casino or on some speculative scheme. You didn't blow the money on things you didn't need. By every traditional measure anyone ever taught you, you were the responsible one at that kitchen table. The system simply, quietly rewarded attention over raw effort, and nobody ever sat down a 34-year-old version of you and explained that the 10 minutes you spent skimming an enrollment email instead of actually reading it would end up being worth roughly $500,000 3 decades later. Level 4. Age 55. The fort. Level 5. The part nobody talks about. Why this keeps happening to good people. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further. If the fix really is this simple, why doesn't everyone just do it? Part of the answer is design. Retirement plans are built around defaults on purpose, because behavioral researchers learned decades ago that most people never change their default settings for anything in their lives. Not their phone ringtone, not their browser homepage, and certainly not a retirement account buried 3 menus deep on a website they open once a year. At most, if that. The stable, low-growth fund isn't a trap set by anyone malicious sitting behind a desk somewhere. It's simply the path of least resistance. And most human beings, entirely understandably, take the path of least resistance when life is already demanding every ounce of their attention just to get through the week. Part of the answer is fear disguised as caution. Words like stable and safe are chosen carefully, because they're designed to feel reassuring, and for a lot of people, especially people who grew up watching their own parents struggle financially or lose money in some downturn, safe feels like the only responsible word to hide behind. Nobody wants to be the person who gambled the family's entire future on the stock market, so they choose the option with the comforting name on the label, without ever learning that safe, in this specific context, was quietly the far riskier long-term choice of the two the entire time. And part of the answer is simple lack of information, not lack of intelligence, and this distinction matters enormously. This has nothing to do with how smart you are compared to Marcus. Marcus isn't smarter than you. He didn't graduate from a better school or read more books. He just happened to open one email on one random Tuesday night that you happened to close without a second thought. That is genuinely the entire difference sitting at the root of a gap worth over $1 million. Level 6. What Marcus actually did, step by step. Let's slow this down, because the specifics matter more than the story. Marcus logged into his retirement account portal using the same login credentials he'd had for 5 years and never used for anything beyond checking the total balance. He found a tab, usually labeled something like Investment Elections or Fund Lineup, that most people never click on in their entire working life. Inside that tab, he saw a list of fund options with strange-sounding names and small percentage numbers next to them, showing historical performance. He didn't need a finance degree to understand what he was looking at. He simply compared the historical returns of the Stable Value Fund, sitting around 2% a year, against a broad market index fund, sitting around 8 to 10% a year over long stretches of time. He read a short description explaining that the index fund would rise and fall with the market in the short term, but had a long history of growing significantly over decades for people who left it alone. He clicked a few checkboxes. He confirmed the change. He closed his laptop and went to bed. That single evening, repeated by nobody sitting at your kitchen table, is the entire mechanical explanation behind a $1 million difference 27 years later. Not a secret handshake. Not a hidden formula. A 10-minute website interaction that most people simply never bother to have. He didn't stop contributing during rough years either. When markets dropped sharply in his 40s, Marcus didn't open the app and panic. He barely opened it at all. He kept the same 6% flowing in automatically every 2 weeks, rain or shine, recession or record high, because he had made his one real decision back at 35 and had nothing left to decide after that. That absence of decisions, oddly enough, turned out to be just as important as the original decision itself. Every dollar he contributed during the down years bought more shares at a lower price, shares that were worth considerably more once the market inevitably recovered, the way it always eventually has. That's the quiet, unglamorous mechanism sitting underneath every version of this story. Not brilliance, not timing. Just one decision, followed by 27 years of simply not undoing it. Level 7. Age 61, the number on the screen today, which brings us back to exactly where we started this entire story. You are 61 years old, and you have $84,000 saved for retirement. Marcus is 61 years old, and he has $1.2 million. Jake is 61 years old, and he has around $400,000, better than you by a wide margin, but still quietly haunted by the 2 exhausting decades he spent fighting the market instead of learning to trust it and simply leave it alone, the way Marcus did from the very beginning. 3 people. The exact same starting income at 34. The exact same kind of jobs. The exact same number of years worked, side by side, decade after decade. Wildly, almost unbelievably different outcomes, sitting on 3 different screens today. And the difference was never truly about how much money any of the 3 of you earned along the way. It was entirely about what each of you did, or quietly failed to do, with the money you already had sitting right in front of you the entire time, every single year, for 27 years. Level 8. What this means for you, right now, tonight. Maybe you're watching this at 61, like the version of you in this story. Maybe you're watching it at 34, standing at that exact same kitchen table Marcus once stood at, with the same unopened email, sitting in your inbox right now, this very evening. Either way, the next 10 minutes matter more than almost anything else you'll do this week. If you're closer to Marcus's starting point, the math is almost unfair in your favor. A small, boring, unremarkable decision made today has decades to compound quietly in the background, while you go on living an ordinary life, raising kids, paying a mortgage, taking ordinary vacations. You don't need to become an expert. You don't need to check it daily the way Jake did. You need to look once, adjust once, and then largely leave it alone. If you're closer to 61, like the version of you at the start of this video, the math is harder, but it is not hopeless. And this matters enormously. $84,000, redirected today into something that can actually grow, still has years left to work for you. It will not become $1.2 million. Time doesn't work that way in reverse. But it can become meaningfully more than it would have become sitting exactly where it's been sitting, untouched for the last 27 years. The version of you at 71 will either thank the version of you watching this right now or quietly resent them. That choice is still entirely sitting in front of you. The specific numbers in this story will look slightly different depending on your own plan, your own contribution rate, your own timeline. The shape of the story almost never does. Somewhere, right now, there is a Marcus. Somewhere, right now, there is a Jake. And somewhere, right now, sitting exactly where you're sitting, there's a version of you who either opens that account tonight or closes this video and goes back to skimming the next open enrollment email in 10 seconds lat, the full circle. What the secret actually was all along, the secret was never about picking the one right stock at the one right moment in time. It was never about timing the market the way Jake spent 2 exhausting decades trying and repeatedly failing to do. It was never about knowing some insider trick that wealthy people supposedly whisper about behind closed boardroom doors that the rest of us are never invited into. The secret was 10 minutes at age 35. Opening the account, scrolling past the summary page to see exactly where the money was actually sitting the whole time, and moving it into something that could genuinely compound over decades, and then, just as importantly, leaving it alone to do its work quietly in the background for the next 27 years without interference. That's it. That is the entire secret that made millions rich, stripped all the way down to its simplest, most unglamorous form. You still have time to open that account today. You will not get Marcus's 27 years of compounding back, not all of it. Nobody gets that specific kind of time back, and anyone who promises you a shortcut around that fact is almost certainly trying to sell you something you don't need. But the 10 minutes it takes to look, the exact same 10 minutes Marcus spent back at 35, is available to you right now, this evening, at whatever age you happen to be watching this video, whether that's 35 or 65. The people who end up rich are not smarter than you. They are not luckier than you. And in most cases, as Jake's 20 exhausting years prove beyond any doubt, they are not even trying harder than you. Trying too hard, in the wrong direction, chasing headlines instead of trusting time, can cost you more in the end than doing absolutely nothing at all ever could. They just looked, once, at the one moment it actually mattered, instead of quietly trusting a default that was never designed with their best interest in mind in the first place. Because here is the plain, uncomfortable truth almost nobody ever says out loud. The default was never built to make you rich. It was built to make sure you never had to think, never had to choose, and never had to do anything at all, for anyone's benefit but the system's own convenience. So look today, not tomorrow, not next open enrollment season, 6 months from now, when it's easy to forget all over again. Today, those same 10 minutes are still sitting there waiting for you, exactly the way they were once quietly waiting for Marcus at 35, and exactly the way they will keep waiting for you, unclaimed, for as long as you let them. The only question left standing between you and the rest of this story is whether you're finally going to take them. Marcus never thought of himself as the hero of a story like this. He didn't feel wealthy at 35, or 45, or even at 55, sitting in the same ordinary house, driving the same ordinary car as everyone around him. He simply made one quiet decision on one quiet Tuesday, and then let 27 years of ordinary, unremarkable time do everything else on his behalf, without asking for credit, and without ever once checking to see if anyone was watching. You don't need his salary. You don't need his luck, because luck was never actually part of this story. You need 10 minutes tonight, and the willingness to look at something you've been avoiding for far longer than you'd like to admit. The account is still there. The email is still sitting in your inbox. The 10 minutes are still waiting.